Well, hello. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this call. My name is John Peat. I'm the Brexit editor of The Economist. And with me is Anand Menon, who runs the UK in a Changing Europe, the academic think tank. And we're going to talk about, after the Windsor Framework, are EU-UK relations going to improving, and where will they go from here? So, Anand, what's your first answer to that question? Does the Windsor Framework make a huge difference to EU-UK relations?
In terms of style, yes, absolutely, they are improving. I mean, and you see that across not just the sort of the clear warming of relations between Sunak and other heads of state and government, particularly in the light of the French summit, but you see it at all levels of government. I mean, Foreign Office officials will talk about the fact that, you know, the ministers of transport get on really well, that Suella Braverman gets on pretty well with certainly her French counterpart. So, and I think the Windsor Framework unlocked the ability to be friends with European countries again and to sort of rub along nicely. What that means in substantive terms, I think, is a whole different question. But there's been a change in the mood music, no doubt at all.
And what on the Windsor Framework itself, I mean, there were some people who suggested that actually Sunak slightly oversold it, you know, talking about there's really no trace of a border in the Irish Sea. And of course, it hasn't worked with the Democratic Unionist Party, which is still refusing to go back into the power sharing executive. Do you think there's some truth in the claim that the Windsor Framework isn't quite as dramatic as perhaps Sunak tried to pretend?
No, I mean, he absolutely oversold it, but the crucial thing is he managed to sell it. So in a sense, it doesn't matter how he did it. The art in politics is to get your ideas accepted, and he did that. I mean, it was a lot more easily than I had thought it would be, actually, to be honest.
And do you think this means that the European Research Group inside the Conservative Party is sort of essentially now a busted flush, really?
Well, yes and no. It's clear that people have had enough of the Northern Ireland Protocol. We don't know whether that means people have had enough of Brexit, and of course we'll get the trial of strength over that with the fate of the retained EU law bill. And we don't know whether the ERG have been transformed into something that worries about something other than Europe. So, you know, there are a lot of troublesome backbenchers in the Conservative Party. What we don't know is whether they've decided either we're not going to be troublesome because we've got an election to fight, or we are going to be troublesome, but we're going to be troublesome on net zero or relations with China or tax. So it might be that they've decided to sort of plant their flag on a different hill, but only time will tell.
Yeah. And Boris Johnson himself, just, I don't know, there could still be trouble with Boris, but maybe not.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. We were having a conversation in the office this morning, actually, and we were sort of profoundly divided we were only a small team about whether it would be better for Sunak if there were a by-election that Johnson lost, or better if he stayed as an MP. Which would Number 10 want as the outcome from this? And personally, I think that there is a case to be made that actually a 10-day suspension followed by a by-election that Johnson lost would probably be easier for Sunak in the medium term. But there's a convincing counter-argument as well.
Yeah, quite. Okay, well, maybe we should sort of move on to talk a bit about where things might go from here. I mean, people sort of say, as you just said, obviously the mood is better. The Northern Ireland Protocol and arguing over it and the threat of the British government to tear it up clearly has, in a sense, sort of overhung this relationship, the relationship between the EU and the UK, more or less since the withdrawal agreement, the TCA, came into force. Now, Windsor Framework supposedly more or less addresses that issue, at least for the time being. But what does it mean in practice? You know, an improvement of relations between the EU and the UK. What kind of things actually does that seriously mean, apart from just saying, well, we can be a bit friendlier?
Well, the short and unsatisfactory answer is we probably don't know yet. I mean, we should slightly hold our horses because, of course, there was that statement by the EU yesterday saying, well, we're not going to ease things going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland until you start putting the the sort of physical infrastructure in place. So there's, I assume that this government, given what it's done to date, will go ahead and put that infrastructure in place, but you can never be certain. But assuming they do, I mean, there is just the function of getting on better because you've got the agreement, and I think that's not something to be sniffed at. In substantive terms, we don't know. I'm not quite sure what the government is doing over Horizon. I'd assume that one of the things that would happen very quickly after this was the government would sign up to Horizon and hail it as a victory of its newfound diplomatic strategy. But there seems to be a hold up, and it seems to be genuinely the case that the Prime Minister isn't certain whether Horizon is worth what we're being asked to pay for it. And moving on under this government, under this Conservative government, I would be very surprised if they tried to get substantive bolt-ons to what we already had. I think the last thing Sunak wants to do is to engage in a negotiation with the European Union to, say, talk about veterinary matters or SPS or anything like that. So in the short term, and the election is going to be sometime next year, and more people actually are saying spring rather than autumn. In the short term, I think in substantive terms, this is going to be pretty much it, with a distinct warming of bilateral relations, as we'll see with the King's visit to Germany today.
Yeah. So bilateral relations may improve, but Horizon, not sure. Mobility, anything on mobility? I mean, even David Frost, when he was in charge of these matters, was saying that he thought there could have been scope for a better deal on mobility, or even just something to do with passport checks. But I mean, all of those things, nobody seems to be talking much about that at the moment.
Well, they did talk about it at the Franco-British Summit. And they talked in particular about school trips. What was interesting was they both stated a desire to do something about the virtual collapse of the school trip industry from continental Europe to the UK. They were very, very short, even by the standards of a communique that was very, very short in detail in general. There was an absolute lack of detail about what they were planning to do. And I've not heard talk that the Home Office is seriously engaging with European counterparts about what to do about identity cards at the moment. And my hunch is there's possibly yet another of those fights within government going on between the Home Secretary and Number 10 about whether or not we should accept identity cards.
Yeah. So, as you just said, it slightly sounds as if under this government, mood music better, but no real detailed sort of proposals for what you might call to be substantive add-ons to the trade and cooperation agreement.
Yeah, and that's partly because this is a querulous and divided governing party, and I think Sunak doesn't want to risk picking fights when he doesn't need to. And negotiating with the European Union raises the spectre of picking fights within his own party.
Yeah, I'd encourage anybody in the audience to sort of put in questions, comments in the chat, and we can take them as and when they appear. But meanwhile, let's just carry on for a moment with a few other issues. There's been a lot of talk about some progress on better security and defence cooperation, and of course, it is the case that in the negotiations over the trade and cooperation agreement, the EU did actually put on the table the possibility of some kind of chapter relating to foreign policy and security cooperation. And then some people have said, we've argued this in my paper, and I think some of your people have argued it, that post the Ukraine war, the case for deeper cooperation is much improved, has increased, as it were. But again, is there much sign of substantive moves in that field, do you think, Anand?
I don't think there's any prospect of this government signing a formal security relationship with the EU for the reasons we've just discussed. David Lammy published this tome with the Fabian Society yesterday, a proportion of which was devoted to the need for a comprehensive security arrangement with the European Union. I think here the thing that I wonder about is, it is absolutely the case that the need for more far-reaching cooperation has been illustrated all too clearly by what's happening in Ukraine. Whether the way to achieve closer cooperation is via a formal security deal with the European Union or not, I'm not so sure. I mean, David's paper yesterday, again, talked in glowing terms about how we should have this far-reaching security pact with the European Union, had very little to say about what would actually be in it or what it would do. And one question I posed, to which I've never heard a really satisfactory answer, is, if we'd had a security deal with the European Union as part of the trade and cooperation agreement, which parts of our cooperation with our European partners over Ukraine would have gone differently or better? And I'm not sure things would have been all that different. So I suppose the bottom line is it depends what's on offer in this security deal. If it's simply your bog standard third-party agreement, like, say, Norway have, I wonder about the practical utility of that. And one of the interesting things about UK-EU collaboration when it comes to foreign policy is the EU is obviously happy to talk about foreign policy cooperation. It's far less happy to include the UK in things that have an economic dimension, be that the sort of shared ammunition scheme that they've come up with or the European Defence Fund. So, you know, the post-Brexit reality that defines this relationship, I think, is we are going to be economic competitors, and the question is whether at the same time we can be close allies.
Yeah. And it is, I mean, again, not necessarily under this government, would there be scope for some kind of institutional link with the Brussels foreign policy and security machinery, as it were? Because to some extent, I think this conservative government has often said, of course, we're all linked together through NATO, and of course we have strong bilateral relations and bilateral security arrangements with France, but they've been much more allergic to having anything to do with the EU machinery in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty convinced that something will be signed under a Labour government. I'm less convinced that it'll be something that makes a massive difference, but something will be signed. Now, what are the one of the obvious advantages of having a formal link with the European Union is you will presumably have regular meetings between the UK and its European counterparts, and the more interaction there is, the better if you're trying to coordinate positions or sort of learn what your partners are thinking. So in that limited sense, I think there is scope for it. Whether or not there is anything more substantive than that, or anything that gets the UK more involved in EU thinking on foreign security policy, it's hard to say, and it's hard to see, to be honest, because, you know, the parallel to the debate about how the EU should work with the United Kingdom is a debate about EU strategic autonomy. It's slightly pulled in a different direction.
Yeah, no. And EU-NATO relations have always been slightly difficult, actually. Do you think that's a fair comment?
Yeah, no, they have always. I mean, you know, they've waxed and waned, haven't they? They started trying to sort of institutionalize it around the time of Kosovo, as I recall, trying to sort of figure out what the relationship between the two organizations would be. I think in some ways, what's happened in Ukraine has helped clarify things, because, you know, you have a territorial war on European soil. That's what NATO is for. But there are clearly aspects of security and aspects of non-European security where Europeans ought to be working together very, very closely, not least when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, where I think talking more regularly will be a very, very good first step. First step. No, I agree with that. Shall we talk a bit about economic relations, where you, as you just, I think, suggested, in the economic field, it's a bit more difficult because, to some extent, the EU and the UK are competitors rather than, as it were, colleagues. And clearly, if the UK does go down a route of greater regulatory divergence, by assumption, one of the reasons the UK might want to do that is indeed to gain a competitive advantage over the EU. Is that sort of general sort of setting going to make it much more difficult to build on to the TCA other bits of sort of economic value? I mean, businesses are always complaining about how hard it is to circumvent EU rules. People are, you know, it would be nice to be able to sort of simplify the process a bit. But on the other hand, if you start doing that, you're going down the route of, you know, well, you're not in the single market, so you can't have. I mean, it is, I think, amazing the degree to which this is a question of being in or out, in the sense that the majority of the economic impacts of Brexit come from being outside the single market. And unless there's an enormous change of heart on the European side, we're either in the single market or we're not. We're not in bits of it, or sort of cherry picking, as the phrase would have it. So there are things you can do that will make life easier for people who export sort of animal products or foodstuffs. SPS, veterinary stuff will make their lives easier. But that sort of arrangement will only scratch the surface of the broader macroeconomic impacts of Brexit. So if it's the macroeconomics you're worried about, the single market is your answer, and then you've got some difficult questions about whether an EEA type thing is sustainable for the UK or whatever. So there's all sorts of things around the edges we can do with the European Union. On the question of divergence, yes, that will make things difficult. Particularly, there are some areas where we're seeing it. We're seeing it today. The British government is releasing its plans for AI regulation today, and they'll be different to what the EU has decided, and they'll be lighter touch and more liberal. And that's the great Brexit dream, isn't it? That new technology, people who want to invest in new technologies come here first because we're less burdensome in terms of the regulations people have to comply with. The really interesting thing will be whether the government decides to go forward in areas like data, where there is a clear danger of a significant impact on trade if we diverge from EU rules, because we'll lose the adequacy decision that we have.
Yeah. Yes. And there will be others like that. I mean, and they'll keep up financial services. There's a fish issue. I mean, we're about to go into a process, of course, it's worth reminding people of this. We're about to go into a process of fairly continuous review and looking at aspects of the deal, and then, of course, reviewing the entire TCA itself, all of which may go under the new British government. And I don't know whether that's going to help the relationship or cause problems. What do you think, Anna?
Well, I can't remember a fisheries negotiation that helped a relationship. So, and that's, the fishing quotas are due to be renegotiated. So, and of course, before that, we have to start talking about rules of origin and electric vehicles, where there is a deadline for the current sort of slightly lax rules. I think it's 2024 when the two sides have got to come together and decide whether to extend the current arrangements. It's probably in both sides' interest to extend them in the short term, but we're lagging badly behind in terms of our capacity to make batteries. So that's something the British government needs to be thinking about. There are all sorts of negotiations, as you say, that are scheduled. There's negotiation. It is not coincidental that the deadline for deciding whether to renew cooperation in the energy sector falls on the same day as the deadline for getting new fishing quotas agreed. I think that was a bit of planning on the EU side. So there's a sort of long-term, there's a medium-term sort of series of negotiations that are provided for under the arrangements we've already signed, on top of which, particularly if we get a Labour government, there will be parallel negotiations about whether or not we can build on the TCA. And in parallel to which, again, I assume now that the sort of various institutional sort of bits and pieces created by the TCA will actually start working properly now that we seem to have sorted the dispute over the protocol. So there's a lot of bilateral talking to be done. But the bottom line is, you can fix tiny bits here and there, but the broad macroeconomics are linked to the single market. And that, of course, is a toxic debate here in the UK.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think that, sometimes people in Brussels have said that the EU-Swiss relationship is always a little bit fraught, although the Swiss are kind of in the single market for goods. But on details, there's always arguments going on. The same thing will happen with the UK and the EU. Yeah,
and there's a question here about is the relationship going to be fraught for a number of years? And yes,
I was about to put it to you. So yes, from Paulo Dubia from the Department of Finance, retired. Yes, does the EU think the UK has demonstrated good faith in its negotiations?
I mean, there are several aspects to this, aren't there? Firstly, I think the EU thinks that Rishi Sunak is someone they can do business with. You can imagine a world post an election that Sunak loses, where he is replaced by, let's say, for the sake of argument, Suella Braverman. Okay. Which isn't inconceivable. I'm not saying it's the most likely outcome, but it's not inconceivable. At that point, I imagine the EU thinks to itself, well, hang on, we quite like this Starmer guy, and he's sort of offering to negotiate in areas where there is mutual benefit to be had. However, should we waste our time and energy negotiating with the United Kingdom that in 4 years' time might be headed by Suella Braverman, who, we assume will unpick everything that Starmer has negotiated? So there's that layer to trust, which is sort of time inconsistencies. How long will the UK be reliable for? But there's the broader geopolitical point, I think, which relates to your point about Switzerland, which is, if you're Canadian, you spend an awful lot of time fretting about what the Americans are doing. If you're an Asian country, you spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about China. If you're a neighbor of the European Union, a continental-sized economy, the European Union is going to preoccupy you in your thinking about all sorts of things, not least economic regulation. However good relations are between the two sides, we are doomed to worry about the European Union now forever, essentially, because what the European Union does matters so profoundly to what we do. You mentioned divergence earlier, and divergence isn't simply a question of what the UK decides to do. And, we can touch on the retained EU law bill later if you want. It's also a question of what the EU does. And things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism has enormous implications for the UK. And it's not us doing it, it's the EU doing it. But it's something that is sort of exercising quite a lot of people here at the moment.
And actually, the same questioner is asked, given the Brussels effect, what is the point of Brexit? Which I interpret that question as really meaning, given the size of the EU, isn't it quite difficult for even a gung-ho Conservative government to diverge significantly in regulation?
Yes, and that's always been an issue. I suppose the rationale would be that we could attract investment by being more nimble and more agile and better in our regulation than the EU is. So we wouldn't be so precautionary in our approach to regulation, which might attract some of that finance for, new areas of economic activity like AI or driverless cars or whatever it might be. There's also, of course, the broader question, I suppose, is whether we haven't just picked the worst possible moment in decades to do Brexit, because Brexit in an era of globalization, with flourishing trade, with a WTO system that is working properly, looks very different to in a world where countries don't believe in sort of industrial policy. Looks very different to Brexit in the current era, where globalization to some extent is being rolled back, where the WTO isn't working, where both the US and the EU are investing massively in domestic industries in what is basically a hugely protectionist manner. This is a very uncomfortable time to be doing Brexit, I think, in terms of what's happening in international trade.
In effect, it's sort of, if the world is dividing up into blocks, one led by China, one led by America, and another led by the EU, where on earth does the UK fit into that?
Yeah, and there's that the whole debate about, we can't compete with IRA or with the EU's equivalent because our market isn't big enough to sustain that scale of company.
Can I just take you back for 1 minute, Anand, since there's a question from Miriam Watson from the EEAS. In the field of foreign policy and defence cooperation, are there fields that would add value, particularly in terms of formal cooperation?
Well, yeah, the EU could change its rules for the European Defence Fund and be more open to third countries, and I'm sure we'd love that. I'm not saying it's necessarily in the EU's interest. Yes, from looked at from this side of the channel, the sort of economics of defence is an area where there is a slight concern that the UK will be locked out, perhaps for good reasons. On the broader stuff, when it comes to collaborating on civilian or military missions or planning or things like that, that kind of depends what's on offer. I have a degree of sympathy with the argument made by people in the Johnson government, which is a bog standard third country deal on foreign policy of the kind you give small countries without much to offer is really not that attractive to the United Kingdom, which has so much more to offer. On the other hand, decision-making autonomy is written into the EU treaties, and it's hard to see how the UK can get a formal voice. But whether or not some creative thinking can make some kind of halfway house attractive to both sides, I don't know. But the UK, certainly UK decision makers under Conservative governments are very sensitive to, if you like, the sort of the status of the UK when it comes to foreign and security policy, and very keen not to sign up to something that just makes us look like just another supplicant third country.
Yeah, but it is a fact that the UK is relative to the EU is small. The EU is bigger, which is basically, it's part of the story of the last 7 years. Actually, I was going to ask you a general question myself. I will come back to some from the audience as well. But given what I just said, the UK basically small, the EU big, And thinking about Stefan de Rink's recent book on how the EU got Brexit done, do you think that that's in fact the story of the last 7 years, that the EU got what it wanted, and the UK, despite the sort of some of the banter, some of the threats, the threat of no deal, even the threat of the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, that actually the UK really didn't get much of what it wanted?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, you have lots of arrangements for manufacturing where the EU enjoys a surplus in trade with us and very little in services. I think it's a very zero-sum way of looking at trade. But I think overall, yes, the EU got what it wanted. I mean, the big question is whether the EU wanted the right thing. My sense of how the EU approached the negotiations was it approached them in a very defensive way. Early on there was this fear of emulation, and it was a kind of, there was this element of we've got to make it clear that leaving is bad. And I think if the EU had approached the negotiations in a more self-confident frame of mind, which was very hard given what was going on, combination of Brexit and Trump and then the onset of the pandemic. But had the EU approached this in a more confident frame of mind, I wonder whether the thinking wouldn't have been, okay, look, they've made a decision, they will come to regret it, but actually it's in our joint interest to try and figure out a way of cooperating as broadly as possible, including on the big geopolitical issues of our time, because ultimately that's what really matters. Now, it's very hard to think like that in the middle of what turned out to be quite an emotional, on both sides, it has to be said, negotiation. But I think, it'll be interesting to see if with the passage of time, both sides can step back a bit and say, hey, come on, look, it makes no sense for us not to have a very close working relationship on some of these big global issues where our interests are identical.
Yeah, I think that, to me, that particularly describes the period of the May negotiation, when actually the EU wasn't really being very helpful to her, despite her clearly being in trouble with her own party. The EU retained law bill, Malcolm Harbour, our old internal market expert friend, wants to know, is that going to be a very defining moment in the way that a more practical and cooperative relationship could work? I mean, in other words, the EU retained law bill is a serious problem for businesses in the country, and it's quite a serious problem for the EU itself. And a supplementary to that is, do you think actually Rishi Sunak is going to be strong enough to say, actually, we should drop this bill?
Firstly, hi, Malcolm. I hope you're well. It is a massive thing. My assumption, and again, we argue about this in the office, is that even if it gets onto the statute book, it will be delayed. There's a lot of talk in the government about delaying the deadline for sunsetting EU laws till 2026, at which point, current polling being what it is, I'd expect the Labour government to shelve it. That would be my guess, but there are a lot of assumptions behind that guess. But I don't think this Prime Minister has any intention of letting this thing hit the statute books and that sunset date of the end of this year to actually be implemented. Some cynics are saying that they're kind of hoping that the House of Lords for so long that actually, it gets forgotten about. That's not going to happen. But I think, there is so much opposition to it here. Just read the sort of Peter Foster newsletters week in, week out, and there basically isn't a business association in the UK that hasn't expressed its horror at this piece of legislation. But the question again, there is this question of political strength. He's got another fight ahead of him, because actually what makes this so difficult, and it's amazing how many people have sort of forgotten about this. The roots of Tory Euroscepticism were deregulatory. They weren't about immigration. They weren't about the sorts of things we heard about in the referendum campaign. They were about being stifled by over-regulation from Brussels. And that strand of thinking is still quite a powerful one within the parliamentary party. And I think for that reason, even though this is a dreadful piece of legislation, it is seen as totemic by a number of prominent Brexiters in the Parliamentary Conservative Party. So you're right, Rishi Sunak is going to have a fight on his hands, but I think he's going to have to take that fight on, and I think he will take that fight on. Whether he does it in a subtle way by saying, actually, what we've decided to do is put back the deadline for the 10th anniversary of the referendum so we can prepare a bit better, that, I suspect, is what he will do.
Yeah, maybe. Although it is worth reminding people, and sometimes reminding people in Brussels, Rishi Sunak is a very firm believer in Brexit, and he thinks that Brexit is valuable, is going to boost the economy, and I think he really believes in regulatory divergence. He's perhaps being more sensible now. He's in number 10, but he's not a sort of he's not suddenly a Remainer, as it were. There's a question from Mel Rodriguez about whether there's, having got the framework agreement in place, that there's going to be more progress with the joint UK-EU Financial Regulatory Forum. And perhaps, do you have any views on financial alignment, financial regulation?
Well, not with any great degree of expertise, I have to say, but just building on what you just said, John, I think financial services is clearly one area where there is a deep skepticism in London about aligning with EU rules. The Bank of England famously has expressed doubts during the Brexit negotiations about equivalence decisions that would leave us reliant on rules over which we had no say. But secondly, is also an area where I think the Prime Minister genuinely thinks that there are global opportunities for a Britain that regulates differently from the European Union. So I'd be surprised, even if the mood music changes and we find a lot easier to sit in a room and have civilized conversations together, which I think will be the case, whether we're going to see a great push for financial sector alignment from this British government, because I genuinely think it's one of the areas where the Prime Minister sees divergence as being a positive for the UK.
Yeah, yes, I would agree with that too. And we need to jog back once or twice through some of these questions. Catherine Stock has asked from the European Parliament, any further thoughts on where Northern Ireland goes from here? I mean, the DUP seems to have dug itself into a position of saying they're just not satisfied. There is even talk in today's newspapers about a new threat of violence in Northern Ireland. Yeah. Northern Ireland is going to be still a rather unsettled place for quite a while to come, partly because of, in a sense, because of what Brexit has done to it.
Well, more unsettled. I think we should be clear about this. More unsettled than it would have been, because the Brexit divide has reopened the sectarian divide. If you look at polling about the protocol, it falls in precisely sectarian lines. Some of the difficult conversations about Northern Ireland are difficult conversations we would have had anyway. What happens to the growing chunk of people who don't define themselves along sectarian lines in Northern Ireland, given the nature of the Good Friday power sharing agreements? But yeah, Northern Ireland will continue to be unstable. I've lost count of the number of times over the last 7 years where I've said the position adopted by the DUP is untenable, so it will change, and I've been proven to be wrong. I mean, I've been proven, well, I'd like to think I was right in it being untenable, but that didn't mean that they changed it. There's a lot of conspiracy sort of theorizing going on that the DUP will hang on until the May elections with their relative intransigence over the executive in Stormont. And then when they have, hopefully in their eyes, seen off their more extreme unionist rivals, will suddenly see sense and see the point in restarting governing arrangements at Stormont. I don't know, to be honest. All I know is my hunch, and my hunches are generally wrong, is that in a time of economic crisis, when there is so much that government needs to be doing, to be staying out of power sharing in Stormont for months on end is surely going to start eroding support for them when people's minds are so clearly focused on economic issues.
That makes sense, but it's a very unpredictable place. And of course, it's always been difficult for the DUP to accept the notion of a Sinn Féin First Minister.
Absolutely.
Which is one of the reasons they're not there. Nick Collier from Brussels also wants, he agrees with you about the goods versus services, but his question, really, I think you've partly answered this question, is why would the EU want to deepen services cooperation when actually that's where the UK's comparative advantage lies?
I'm going to sound like some pro-globalization dinosaur now by saying because trade is good for both sides, whether you're buying or selling. But just don't believe. I don't believe in an economics that says trade is good when you have a surplus and it's bad when you have a deficit. I think both sides benefit from trade. I think I was going to say something flippant then, I think the EU, well, I saw some numbers the other day that there's been something like a 60 or 70% drop in the number of UK acts performing at EU music festivals from the figures of 2018. EU consumers are being deprived of choice because of this. So I think both sides stand to benefit from opening up trade. It shouldn't be seen simply as British suppliers will profit from this. EU consumers will profit from it as well. And I'm sure there are all sorts of joint ventures in services that are suffering now because of the difficulties of doing services trade.
And Juliet Lodge asks a question about the administrative costs to both sides of Brexit. I mean, people have pointed out that the size of the British civil service has increased considerably since 2016.
Yeah.
Do you think people have understood that in a sense, both sides have lost because of the more greater administrative burdens?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been a smaller proportion for the EU than it has for us. But yeah, the administrative burden here has been huge, whether you think about it in terms of, governing time lost. I keep saying this, but I do think it's true that essentially since 2016, we've not been governed in the UK because first Brexit and then COVID totally distracted political attention from anything else. So we've got a governing backlog. The civil service has had to increase. We've got a massive gap when it comes to regulatory capacity. Again, I'm going to keep quoting Peter Foster. I hope he's not watching as I do it. Peter's got this curious infatuation with radiators, and he continually cites some. I can't remember the exact figure, but how many hundreds of years it would take to do conformity assessments on all British radiators if we left it to purely British assessors, because we don't have capacity in so many areas to do the things that we now have to do by ourselves because we left the European Union. It's one of the reasons why, and it's one of the thousands of Brexit sort of paradoxes, that that we no longer adequately police our border with the European Union because we simply haven't got enough people. It's partly because we haven't got the software in place. It's partly because we don't have the people, but it's putting enormous strains on us in administrative terms. And that's just the government, I remember seeing some figures from Make UK, the trade body, back in 2018, 2019, estimating the costs for manufacturing of filling in customs declarations, which sounds like a fairly trivial task, at billions per year, simply because of the sheer volume of those customs declarations that would have had to be filled out. So yeah, enormous administrative costs falling both on the public and the private sector.
And this is all before we introduce formal customs checks and procedures on goods coming from the EU into the UK, which we have put off doing, as I understand it, which presumably will be another burden.
If we ever do it. I mean, David Frost famously said we want light touch borders.
Yeah.
Light touch borders we've taken control of, as it might be seen by some as a slight sort of paradox, but
yeah, well,
I wonder if we'll ever institute the full panoply of checks.
Although I think it might be WTO inconsistent if we don't do that.
Oh, it absolutely will be. And, there is a question then, isn't there, as to whether an Australia or a New Zealand say, hang on, stuff coming in from the European Union is not being checked. I mean, if you're, it is, of all the many things you couldn't have predicted about Brexit, the fact that it would lead to a situation where UK exporters face that full panoply of checks when they export to the European Union, whereas EU exporters just get to ship things in the UK with barely a cursory glance at them. I don't think anyone could have predicted that.
Yeah. One more question from Malcolm Harbour about could mutual recognition of qualifications be put on the table, which would make some progress on services. I myself have no idea whether there's scope for doing that, but it has been talked about occasionally.
Keir Starmer's talked about it. I'm pretty certain that Labour will put it on the table. There are other things as well to do with, having visa-free services provision for 90-day periods. There are all sorts of things. There was the standard EU mobility package was offered to Britain, I think, in March of 2020 when the TCA was being negotiated, and the government, actually not the government, the Home Office said no because it smelt a little bit like freedom of movement. So, I think this is something Labour will be keen to explore. I'm not 100% certain it's something the EU would be desperate to grant, but we'll have to wait and see. I mean, one of the interesting things, we did an event with Michel Barnier a couple of months ago. And I had to read his book quite carefully beforehand. And I remember sticking sort of those sticky bits of paper in on every occasion where he talked about cherry picking, and the thing being asked for by Theresa May and rejected on the grounds of cherry picking by the EU struck me as essentially identical to what Labour said they will ask for. There is a real danger that Labour will, I mean, who knows? Maybe the EU will alter their position because they're negotiating with the Labour government, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. But I suspect Labour haven't learned many of the tough lessons from the Brexit process about just how difficult it is to negotiate with the European Union.
I very much agree with that. I've heard Rachel Reeves put forward a sort of a whole lot of things that she thinks we would be good for us. And the question the EU will obviously say is, since you're not joining the single market, why should we give you bits of it that you happen to like? Which
You know,
is
I'm always going to look forward to lots of speeches about frictionless trade from new Labour ministers.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. One question from somebody from the EEA, if I can find it, about the small boats bill, as I call it, illegal migration bill, and the risk at some point that this may raise the question of belonging to the ECH. I mean, that would obviously, if we went down that route, that route, that would clearly cause some friction between the EU and the UK.
Yes. I mean,
he's in the TCA as well.
Yeah, the TCA, I mean, it's inherent to the Good Friday Agreement. It will cause all sorts of problems. What worries me slightly about this is that the debate within the Conservative Party about the ECHR reminds me of the debate they used to have about the European Union, which is to say, the government's answer to the question, why aren't you simply taking us out of the ECHR, seems to be there seems to be no good reason to do so at the moment. So it's not a defense of the ECHR. It's not a stirring defense of, you know, well, we set up this organization, we did it for good reason, it ensures minimal standards. Do we really want to be one of the European countries? I mean, you know, you all know the case for being in it. It's been lukewarm. And this sort of reminds me of David Cameron a little bit when he used to say, oh, God, I'd rather be anywhere on earth than at a Brussels European Council again. And sort of that mood music becomes self-reinforcing till at a certain point, and to everyone's surprise, there's a majority for pulling out. So I don't think the Prime Minister wants the ECHR to be on the table in this discussion over the illegal migration bill. I'm cynical enough to think many of his party strategists don't actually think the bill will do anything apart from keep small boats, asylum seekers in hotels in the headline and potentially make life difficult for them. I think there's a lot of performative politics around in the UK at the moment, and the immigration debate is a case in point. But I do worry that in the future, ECHR will become one of those shibboleths for a section of the Conservative Party, which, if they take control of the Conservative Party, might actually appear in a Conservative manifesto in the future.
I'm sure that could happen were Suella Braverman to become the leader of the Conservative Party.
Yeah. I mean, you never know in our politics at the moment whether people intend to do what they say, or whether they say what they say to get elected and try and forget. I mean, I refer you back to last summer's leadership contest where Rishi Sunak released that awful video of himself in front of a shredder talking about scrapping all EU laws within 100 days of becoming Prime Minister. Yes. So, the nature of, one of the many sources of the dysfunctionality of British politics is the way we select our party leaders.
Yes. We have had unfortunate experience over the last few years on both sides of the aisle over the selection of party leaders, which is one of the reasons we are where we are. A broader question about the future. I'm really building on a question that's been put in the chat by Mark English, another old friend. He's talking longer term, 10 to 20 years. Given the decline in support for Brexit, given the evident economic impact of Brexit, do you think that in 10 to 20 years, the UK will have any alternative but to seek to rejoin in some way?
Hi, Mark. I mean, there's obviously going to be an alternative, which is not to seek to rejoin. I don't know is the simple answer. I mean, there's lots of things I could say about it. They've been mulling this over for ages. Let me list the things I don't know. I don't know whether the current polling on particularly the economic impacts of Brexit will continue to look like it does when we're not in an economic crisis. That is to say, I think something rather curious is happening at the moment. I think in 2020 when we left, in 2021 when we left, no one really noticed because COVID was there. And so what were real impacts of Brexit got lost, and it was very, very easy for the government to say, no, that's COVID, what are you talking about? That's rubbish. And people back then underestimated the impact of Brexit. My sense now with an economic crisis raging and Brexit in the news is that the general public are overestimating the impact of Brexit, which is to say, I think Brexit is a relatively small element of the drivers of the current economic problems we've had in the UK. I think the real drivers are the tail end of COVID, what happened in China with the latest lockdowns of last year, Ukraine, soaring energy prices. I don't think Brexit has got much to do with any of that, but I think people are attributing it to Brexit, probably wrongly. If the economy settles back to a time when people are more or less comfortable, I wonder whether they're going to worry about this so much. I don't know whether the EU will become salient again. Remember, now there's only about 9% of people saying that relations with the EU is the most pressing issue facing the country today. Back when we used to see each other in London more, Mark, in 2018, 2019, that number was 70%. That the salience of the issue also matters. And I don't know how far Labour are willing to go. One of the things, for those who campaign to rejoin or campaign for a closer relationship, I'm starting to wonder whether the slightly incremental approach that many people are adopting makes sense, given what I said earlier. Incremental changes aren't going to lead to noticeable shifts in economic outcomes. If you're a farmer, if you're doing an SPS agreement, it makes your life easier, transporting stuff across the border. But in broad macroeconomic terms, it doesn't make much difference. If you're worried about long-term investment in the country, the future of the UK car industry, or the sort of aggregate impact on the economy as a whole, joining the single market is the only thing that works. And I think joining the single market without its membership is particularly problematic for a country like the United Kingdom. So I wonder if we'll see the debate changing and less gradualism on the rejoin side, and whether that is a more sensible strategy. But this is a very long-winded way of not answering your question, Mark. I think it is certainly plausible, I think, that in 20 years' time we are having a serious debate about rejoining. It's plausible that the Conservatives win the next election, which changes everyone's calculations. I certainly wouldn't rule that out. It's plausible that, what happens in the next election is absolutely crucial to this. If the Conservatives win, that's one scenario. If Labour win in a minority government or a small majority, that's another scenario. If Labour win with a big majority and act like Tony Blair did in his first term, i.e. terrified, then that's different to a Labour government coming in with a big majority and being bold. So there are all sorts of scenarios, and amongst those scenarios, there is every possibility that we start a serious debate about rejoin towards the end of the next Parliament, I think.
Yeah. It does raise another question, which actually comes out of the same comment from Mark English. He had it in brackets, I think. Would the EU, welcome such a debate, or would some of them, at any rate, be more likely to say, look, we made a mistake letting the UK in the first place, and we're not going to make that mistake again?
Who knows? And who knows what happens I think it's still the case that there might have to be referenda in some countries around enlargement. Who knows what happens in those things? There are an awful lot of moving pieces here. And it wouldn't be the first time that the EU has said, the first time the EU has said no to us. It wouldn't be the first time that the institutions of European integration have said no to us, or a member state have said no to us.
Yes, I agree with that. There was a question a little while ago from Edwin Hercock about integrating Ukraine ahead of full membership, and he sort of, I think, seems to think that they're not being very creative about that. I think he attributes that to the EU, and therefore they're not very likely to be very creative about Britain seeking a closer relationship with the EU. Do you think there's something in that? Nobody quite knows what to do with Ukraine, or indeed the Western Balkans.
No, I agree. I think a good step would be to stop making rash promises that you are not going to be able to deliver on, because I think we're just storing up problems for the future there. The closest the EU has come to creativity when it comes to enlargement was Bulgaria and Romania, and I think many people inside the EU regret that creativity, or that sort of moving ahead faster than some people thought was absolutely sensible. It's difficult with politics, though, isn't it? Who knows? I think I agree with the spirit of the question, which is that, joining the EU is a long, complicated and technical business, and it cannot and should not be rushed. Otherwise, the EU's moment of maximum leverage over a country is before they join. And once they're in, that leverage, as we find with the number of member states at the moment, drops away quite dramatically. So, I think if I feel uncomfortable talking about the EU now we're out of it, which is a curious sort of psychological side effect of Brexit. But I tend to think that accession criteria should be taken seriously and exceptions shouldn't be made, because the long-term consequences of doing otherwise are quite serious.
I mean, in a sense, I sometimes feel that the one really interesting example of creativity in a relationship is indeed the EU-Swiss relationship. The EEA is a special case. Yes, you can have somebody who's in the single market and fits into a sort of a regime that we can live with. But the Swiss one is in a sense more creative, but on the other hand, it's one that the EU has made very clear they absolutely hate, and they would never want to offer it to anybody else, including the UK.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, the Swiss are cursing us for doing Brexit because it made their negotiations with the EU slightly more fraught than they would otherwise have been.
I mean, in a sense, it goes back to something I've often myself written about, which is that there would be a case for the EU being more creative about what you might call a multi-tier, multi-speed, multi-destination grouping, where some people are partly in and some people are partly not in, but they don't find that a very comfortable arrangement.
No, absolutely, and of course this debate's been hovering around. I think it was Edouard Balladur who came out with the concentric circles idea when I was young.
Yes.
But it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the European political community. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with the meeting that's being hosted in London next year.
Yes. Well, and it does raise another area which you've touched on already. I mean, in the security and foreign policy cooperation, that's mostly nation state anyway. So you could do more in that area, even with non-members. One more question from David Brew about the position of Scotland, Scottish government, which would like to maintain the acquis. Where do you think Scotland's going now? I mean, they still think that they would like to join a separate country.
It's too soon to say. Early signs are that the Labour Party will profit from what's been going on. There's still quite a long time to the next election, so it's very, very hard to make sort of predictions. There has been a resorting of Scottish politics post 2016 referendum, so there are two sort of more or less identifiable camps now of people who want to rejoin the EU and are pro-independence, and people who wanted to leave the EU and are anti-independence. So those two camps are sorting into two broad blocks. The problem for the SNP is the former bloc isn't over 50%, which means that it's quite good if you want to keep governing Scotland. It's not good if you want Scotland to be independent. On the question of Scotland wanting to align, of course, that's not a decision that's solely up to the Scots, and the internal market bill imposes significant costs if there's more regulation in Scotland than there is in the UK. We'll see. I mean, the Scottish government, the latest thing the Scottish government is they're going to look at EU regulations on a case-by-case basis and decide whether or not to align. There clearly is a political incentive to be able to say to the European Union, well, look, we don't have that far to. I think, there are some people in the SNP who are very keen for very quick accession in the event that Scotland becomes independent, and being aligned is seen as one of the sort of arguments they can make. We've kept aligned, and so this process should be a lot quicker than if we were coming from miles away from your regulatory system. But again, there are going to be battles with London over individual bits of legislation, as there have been over this bottle recycling scheme.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Back to regulation for a moment, Anand. Guy Charles Mahik from the ECB representative in London wonders if what you might call a financial crisis, SVB and Credit Suisse and so on, might reduce the desire for deregulation in the UK generally.
Well, hi, Guy Charles. Maybe amongst those who follow those things closely, maybe amongst regulators and people who follow financial services closely in the sort of world of government and politics, yes. Whether more broadly, I don't think much of it was noticed by the general public here. And for the Conservatives, deregulation and financial services deregulation for some of them is a matter of faith. So I'm not convinced it will have a huge political impact on that appetite. And particularly, and this is the way that Brexit distorts everything, in a post-Brexit context, deregulation is all you have to cling on to as one of the great opportunities that Brexit alters. So that will change the calculation, I think, even if what's been going on in the international banking sector would otherwise have made you slightly more risk averse. The need to show practical economic benefits from Brexit will push you in a slightly different direction if you're of a deregulatory mindset.
Yeah. And Peter Holmes, another friend from the UK TPO, wonders whether the UK could formally join the European political community and whether that would matter.
Well, I don't know, is the answer. It depends what EPC turns into. I think that the meeting in London is going to be absolutely crucial in terms of shaping our perceptions of it and the EU's perceptions of us. I don't see much in a practical sense to be gained from it at the moment. There's no real sort of meat on the bones of EPC. I think having a forum where European states can meet and discuss pressing issues is a good idea. But one of the questions is, as part of what we were talking about earlier, this sort of creative thinking, whether ideas about how to collaborate perhaps on security matters outside a strict EU framework are born in those EPC meetings, as was, the idea of North Sea Energy Cooperation. I believe that came from from the last EPC meeting, is where the UK met with several sort of North Sea states, and the idea of having regular summits between them came out of that.
Okay, we've only got 5 minutes left, so if anybody wants to put any more questions in the chat, I haven't covered them all, but I think we've answered quite a lot of them, or at least tried to answer quite a lot of them. I mean, do you feel sort of optimistic, Anand, as we're coming to the end of this very interesting discussion? Do you feel optimistic about the future of EU-UK relations, or do you think it's just going to be rather scratchy, almost whoever's in government?
Well, I mean, as director of an organisation that loves a good crisis, I mean, I could be optimistic if I thought things. I mean, I tend to be optimistic when things are going terribly because that's really good for business. I think things will settle down. Yes, I think things will settle down. I mean, partly just because everyone is fed up and bored.
Yeah.
I think if even the Conservative Party, as the Windsor Framework vote seemed to indicate, has finally tired of banging on about Europe, then I think things will be on a relatively even keel compared to how they were. We're no longer in a world where making facetious comparisons with the European Union or doing the European Union down is seen as good politics. So I think that's been that has shifted, I think, quite fundamentally. So yeah, in that sense, I think relations will be better. I think Ukraine has changed people's outlooks quite fundamentally. Whether that means practical progress, I mean, in a sense, just going back to where we started, I'm not so convinced. I think, we will get on better. Whether that will lead to substantive gains, I'm not so convinced.
Yeah. And Martin Westlake has put in a question as we draw to a close here, actually. Will any of what we've positively discussed be possible without some sort of constitutional reform in the UK that would enable it to develop a genuine national strategy? I mean, I suppose it goes back to a point you have raised. I mean, whether the EU could seriously try to deepen its relationship with, say, a putative Labour government, if at the same time there's a Conservative opposition that says, sorry, we want to tear all that up again.
I mean, short time horizons and adversarial two-party politics don't make for good long-term policy. The problem is that two-party adversarial politics don't really create incentives for the people who win under that system to reform it. So I suspect we're stuck with what we've got, Martin. Unless there's some enormous change of heart on the part of Keir Starmer, who decides to spend time on constitutional reform. I mean, his constitutional reforms seem to focus largely on things to do with the House of Lords, which strikes me rather as a distraction from the main problems we face. But I agree, there is an absolute problem here in terms of short-term politics, but I don't see it being resolved in the near future. And of course, I don't know what will happen to the Conservative Party. My knee-jerk is to sort of look back and think that the Conservative Party will do what it did after 1997, which is sort of drift right before recorrecting again. But that's anyone's guess, and it will depend a lot on who they elect as leader if Sunak loses the election.
I must say, I think that's right. I don't see much sign of a revival of what used to be in the Conservative Party, which was quite a significant pro-European wing.
No, and actually, I think it's the David Lidington and others have set up this Conservative European Forum, but I think they've only got one MP, or only noticed one MP at the launch event, and he's sitting on a majority that looks set to evaporate at the next election. So whether they have MPs who are, and the whole way in which Conservative MPs are selected at the moment seems to indicate the signs are that you have to be a sort of dyed-in-the-wool Brexiter to qualify.
Yes, I think that's probably true. Well, I think probably we should draw the discussion to a close. We were told we had 1 hour. I think we covered a great deal of ground, some very good questions, and some very good thoughts from you, Anand. So thank you very much. Thanks to the organisers, and thanks to the audience for putting all the questions in. I'm sure we will continue to debate this probably for many years to come.
Ad nauseum.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.